Maybe you remember this moment. The house was silent. There was no television on. There was no one speaking. Just that strange silence that sometimes appears in the middle of an ordinary day. And then, you realized something. Your dog was looking at you. Not that quick look dogs give when they want food. No, it was different. He was standing still. Still. Watching you like he's trying to understand something much deeper. Maybe he was lying on the floor. Maybe it was near the door. Or maybe it was exactly in that place in the house where he used to sleep. But the look was different. Silent, deep, almost as if he knew something you didn't already. And maybe you felt something strange at that moment, a feeling that is difficult to explain. As if that small animal that walked around the house with the light sound of its paws, you were noticing something inside you. Something that not even you had realized yet. Now I want to ask you a very sincere question. Have you ever had the feeling that your dog could sense when something wasn't right with you? Before you even say any words? Before you even understood what you were feeling? Many people say the same thing. Difficult days, moments of sadness, silent crises. And suddenly, the dog appears. He approaches. Sit on the side. Lean your body. And it stays there, without doing anything, without asking for anything, without leaving, just staying. As if he knew that, at that moment, his presence was necessary. And if you've ever experienced something like this, maybe you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because anyone who has ever had a dog knows something curious. They seem to notice our feelings even before we do. But there is a question that almost no one asks. A question that can completely change the way you understand the bond between humans and dogs. What if some dogs weren't just living next to us, but protecting something much deeper, something we can't see, something we can't touch, something that sometimes we can't even understand, our own soul? Some people believe that dogs come into our lives just to love us, but others, they begin to notice something different. They begin to notice that certain dogs always seem to be present exactly where they are. Most difficult moments, as if they had a silent mission, as if they were keeping something invisible inside us. And when we start to observe certain behaviors carefully, a curious thing begins to appear. Some dogs don't just love their owners. They seem to protect something much deeper. But to understand this, first, we need to remember something that almost every dog owner has experienced. That sound, the sound of paws walking around the house, especially when you don't even realize you're being followed. There is a very common scene in the lives of anyone who has ever had a dog. Maybe you'll recognize it right away. You get up to go to the kitchen. It doesn't say anything. Don't call anyone. Just walk around the house. And a few seconds later, you hear that light sound behind you. Knock, knock, knock. The sound of paws on the floor. When you look back, he is there, your dog, following you, for no apparent reason. Without ordering food, not wanting to joke. He just decided to go along. Anyone who has ever lived with a dog knows that this happens all the time. You go to the room. He goes along. You go to the bathroom. He waits at the door. You sit on the couch. And a few seconds later, he approaches and lies down nearby. Sometimes it doesn't even touch. It just stays there, observing. Gift. And the curious thing is that many owners say the same thing. There were days when this behavior seemed even more intense. Days when the dog seemed like he didn't want to leave for anything. He continued through the house. He sat on the side. He placed his head on his foot. Or he simply watched you in silence. Now think a little. Can you remember a day like that? A day when your dog seemed to sense something was different about you? Maybe it was a difficult day. Perhaps a moment of sadness. Maybe a concern that you didn't even tell anyone about. but he was there, as if he had noticed. This happens to a lot more people than you might think. Many owners report that their dogs seem to notice emotional changes very quickly. Small changes that other humans didn't even notice. Heavier breathing, different silence, lower energy in the house. And even without words, the dogs seem to react. They get closer. They become more attentive, more gifts, closer. And there is another moment that almost every dog owner knows. That moment at the end of the day, when you're getting home, before even opening the door. Sometimes you can already imagine the scene. He is waiting, maybe sitting near the entrance, maybe walking from one side to the other, maybe looking at the door as if he knows exactly when you'll show up. And when you see you come in, his joy seems disproportionate, as if you came back after years. Anyone who has experienced this knows that there is something very special about this moment. Because it doesn't matter if you had a good day or a difficult day. His dog always seemed to feel it. He always seemed to understand. But here, something even more curious begins. Some people begin to realize that certain dogs do more than just perceive emotions. They seem to position themselves next to their owner exactly at the most delicate aspects of life. Moments when the heart is heavy. Moments when the house seems too quiet. Moments when sadness arrives without warning. And it is precisely at these moments that some dogs do something that seems small, but it carries a deep meaning. They stay. They don't do anything. They don't ask for anything. They won't go away. They simply remain by your side, as if their presence was important. Now I want to ask you a very sincere question. Has your dog ever done this? Has he ever stayed by your side at a time when you were emotionally very bad? If this has ever happened to you, maybe there's something to this bond that most people haven't realized yet. Because when we start to observe these behaviors more closely, an unexpected possibility begins to emerge. And this possibility appears even more strongly when we hear certain stories of dog owners, stories that start simply, but they end with a question that is impossible to ignore. There is a detail in dog behavior that many owners only notice after some time. It's not something that appears every day. In fact, it happens very subtly. But when you start to piece together multiple memories, a curious pattern begins to emerge. Some people notice that their dogs change their behavior exactly when moments when the owner was most emotionally vulnerable, days of deep sadness, anxious days, days when something felt heavy inside, even without a clear reason. On those days, the dog looked different, more attentive, closer, as if he was watching every movement. Maybe you have experienced something like this. You were sitting on the couch, lost in your own thoughts, without talking to anyone, no touching your cell phone, just there. And then, suddenly, your dog approaches, slowly, without making any noise. He lies down next to you, or put his head on your leg, and it stays. Not for a few seconds, but for a long time, as if you decided that at that moment you shouldn't be alone. Some people say that their dogs did this on the hardest days of the year. Life. After an argument, after bad news, after moments of sadness that no one else noticed, but the dog understood. And this raises a very curious question. How do they know? Dogs don't understand our words like another human would, but they are extremely sensitive to something we often ignore. Emotional changes, breathing, posture, tone of voice, even small changes in our body chemistry. Studies show that dogs can perceive hormonal changes linked to stress and sadness. They feel when something inside us changes. But still, this does not fully explain certain behaviors, because some dogs don't just realize something is wrong. They appear to assume a protective position. They get closer, stay tuned, observe, as if they were monitoring the surrounding environment, as if something inside them said that at that moment, it was important to remain. Maybe you remember a very specific scene, a day when you were bad, very bad, and your dog just wouldn't leave your side, not even to go to another room in the house, not even to rest in the place where he used to sleep. He stayed there, still, gift, watching you with that silent gaze, the same look we mentioned at the beginning. And maybe at that time you only thought one thing: he's trying to comfort me. But there is a possibility that many people begin to consider years later. A strange possibility, but deeply touching. What if some dogs weren't just offering companionship? What if somehow they were protecting something inside you? Something that goes beyond the body, something that goes beyond emotions, something much deeper. This idea may seem far-fetched at first glance, but when we hear certain real stories from dog owners, stories that happened in extremely delicate moments, this question begins to take on a different weight, because some of these stories reveal behaviors that seem almost impossible to ignore. And one of them starts very simply, with a dog who, for years, just had a curious habit. He always followed his owner around the house. Some time ago, someone told a story that caught a lot of attention, not because it was extraordinary, but precisely because Arisha, very common. She said her dog has always had a curious behavior. He followed her around the house, always. It didn't matter if she went to the kitchen, up to the bedroom, even the balcony. A few seconds later, he appeared, walking behind, sometimes without making a sound, just that light sound of paws touching the ground. At first she thought it was funny. I thought it was just attachment. That type of behavior typical of a dog very attached to its owner. But as the years went by, she began to notice a different detail. This behavior became much more intense on some specific days. Days when she was emotionally unwell. Days when sadness felt heavy. Days when the house was too quiet. On those days, the dog seemed even more attentive. He didn't just follow, he watched. If she sat on the couch, he sat close by. If she walked around the house, he walked with her. If she stood still and stared into space, he remained there, as if he was waiting, as if I were following something invisible. And one day, something happened that she never forgot. She said she was going through an extremely difficult time in her life, a phase of loss, the kind that leaves the mind confused and the heart heavy. The house was silent. She was sitting on the living room floor. No television, no cell phone, no desire to talk to anyone. And at that moment, your dog did something different. He approached slowly. He sat in front of her, and he looked. Not the usual quick look, but a deep look, far away, silent. She said it lasted several minutes. He didn't look away. It wasn't going away. He didn't lie down. It just remained there, observing. And after some time, he got closer. He leaned his body against her, and he stayed there for almost an hour, without leaving, without moving, just present. Years later, when she remembered that moment, one question always came back to her. Mind. Why did he do this? Why, on that particular day, did he seem so attentive? Why did he seem to notice exactly the moment when she was most fragile? But what really made this story resonate with so many people was something else. Days before leaving, this same dog started acting differently. He started looking at her more often, getting closer, sleeping next to her, even when before I preferred another place in the house, like I'm trying to stay present as much as possible. And on the last day they spent together, she said he did something he had never done before. He went to the door, he looked at her, then he came back and laid his head on her lap. He stood there in silence for a long time, as if it were a kind of farewell. And when she told this story, many people responded with something surprising. They said they experienced something very similar. Dogs that seemed to perceive deep emotions. Dogs that were there in the most difficult moments. Dogs that, before leaving, seemed even more attentive to their humans. And that raised a question that might also be popping up in your mind right now. Could it be that some dogs understand much more about us than we realize? Or could it be that, in some silent way, were they protecting something inside us all along? Because when we start looking at those memories more closely, a very common emotion begins to appear, an emotion that many people carry for years, and sometimes it appears precisely after the dog is no longer there. The guilt. After a dog leaves, something strange happens to the house. Everything remains in the same place. The sofa is still there. The door is still there. The routine continues to happen, but something changes. Something that is difficult to explain. The silence. Anyone who has ever lost a dog knows exactly what I'm talking about. There is a kind of silence that didn't exist before, a silence that appears because something stopped happening. The sound of paws around the house, peaceful breathing near the sofa, the silent presence that seemed to fill the room. And maybe there's a place in the house that still feels different, that place where he used to sleep. Maybe there's still a mark on the floor. Maybe there's still a bed. Maybe you still pass by that place, and for a second hope to see him there, but he's not. And that's when many people start to feel something very heavy. The guilt, thoughts that appear in the middle of the night. Could I have done more? Did I get everything he needed? Did he know how much I loved him? These questions appear for many people, more than you imagine, because when the bond with a dog is deep, loss is not just absence. It leaves a feeling of something unfinished, as if a part of history had been trapped in that last day. Maybe you remember him. The last day, the last look, the last moment he walked through the house. Some people even remember the sound of the paws on that day. Was going. And then, the silence. But here there is something important that almost no one explains to those who are living this type of grief. This pain does not mean weakness, it means bond, a deep bond, a link that the human brain cannot simply turn off. And that's precisely why so many people continue to feel something even after the dog left. Presence, very vivid memories, dreams, unexpected sensations. If the guilt still appears, if the silence in the house still hurts, if you feel like a part of you was stuck that day, it doesn't mean you're not over it. This means that the bond is still active within you, and there is something important that few people learn about grieving for such an animal. Beloved. Time does not reorganize this bond, it just silences him on the outside. Inside, it continues to exist, and until this bond finds a new way of existing within you, the pain tends to recur. That's exactly why I developed a structured process based on psychology of attachment and neuroscience of grief. A process created specifically for those who have lost an animal that was part of their own life. This process is called Eternal Bond Method. It was created to help you. Dissolve the guilt that often appears after loss. Reorganize the emptiness that remains in the house and within the heart. Understand why so many people feel the presence of the animal even after leaving. Transform love without feeling like you are betraying his memory. If you feel like you've suffered too long, maybe it's time to transform this pain. Access to the Eternal Bond Method is below. And in this first month, you can use the coupon, Layli. It's not to be forgotten. It's to transform. Because there is something that many people begin to realize only after going through this process. Something that completely changes the way we look at those silent moments that we live with our dogs. Moments that, at the time, seemed like simple gestures, but today, they can carry a much deeper meaning. There is a time in grief when some memories begin to change their meaning. At first, they hurt. You remember and miss it. Remember and feel silence. Remember and feel absence. But over time, some of these memories begin to raise a question different. a question that many people had never asked before. What if he was doing more for me than I realized at the time? Because when we start to revisit certain moments more calmly, some dog behaviors begin to seem much less random. Maybe you remember one of them now, that day when you were emotionally destroyed. No power, no desire to talk to anyone, maybe sitting on the couch or looking out the window. And your dog just decided to stay by your side, without ordering food, without bringing toys, without trying to get your attention. He just remained, still. Gift. Now imagine this scene another way. What if at that moment, he wasn't just keeping you company? What if he was doing exactly what he felt he needed to do? Protect you. Protect your emotional state. Protect something inside you that was fragile. It may seem like too spiritual an idea to some people. But interestingly, there are studies that show that dogs have an extremely advanced emotional sensitivity. They can perceive minimal changes in the human body, hormonal changes linked to stress, changes in breathing, changes in posture, small variations in voice tone. For them, these changes do not go unnoticed. Now imagine an animal that spends years by your side, observing your habits, your breathing rhythm, your mood, your silence. This animal begins to recognize patterns. He learns when you are okay, and you learn when something inside you is not there. That's why so many owners tell similar stories. Dogs that appear exactly in difficult times, dogs that stay closer during times of sadness, dogs that seem to sense when something is wrong, even when no one has said anything. But there is something even deeper to this, because some of these behaviors seem to go beyond simple emotional perception. Some dogs seem to take on a guardian stance. They observe the environment. They remain close. They follow, as if they had decided that that person needed protection. And perhaps here is one of the most beautiful ideas about the bond between humans and dogs. Maybe some of them come into our lives not just to share moments happy. Perhaps some enter with a silent mission, to care, protect, to accompany, even in times when we can't even take care of ourselves. There is a phrase that sums up this idea well, a phrase that many people feel in their hearts when they look back and remember the your dog. Some dogs come into our lives, you can love us. Others come in to protect us, even from what we can't even see inside us. And when we think about it, certain memories start to make a lot more sense. That silent look, the constant presence, the way he seemed to show up exactly when you needed him most. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe it was bonding. Maybe he was careful. Maybe it was something even deeper. But there is a detail in this story that makes everything even more exciting. Because when we revisit that first memory we mentioned at the beginning of this video, that moment when your dog just stared at you in silence, maybe that look had a meaning that you can only understand now. Now go back with me to that first scene, the one that may have popped into your mind at the beginning of this video. The house in silence. You in some corner of the room, maybe on the couch, maybe looking out the window, maybe just standing still, trying to organize thoughts that felt too heavy. And then you notice something. Your dog is looking at you. It's not a quick glance. It's not that typical look when they want food. It's a different look, still, deep, as if he was trying to understand something inside you. Maybe at that time you only thought one thing. He knows I'm sad. But now, after everything we've said so far, this memory can gain another meaning. Because many owners begin to notice something curious when they remember these moments. His dogs didn't just sense the sadness. They remained. They stayed. Even when there was nothing happening. Even when the owner didn't speak. Even when the environment seemed completely silent. And there is something very powerful in that simple decision to stay. Because when someone is emotionally fragile, silent presence can be the deepest form of protection. And dogs seem to understand this naturally. Speechless. No explanations. They just get closer and stay. Maybe you also remembered something else now. The way your dog followed you around the house. That soft sound of paws walking behind you. Even when you didn't even call. Even when I was just going from one room to another. He was going. Maybe at that moment, it just seemed like ordinary behavior. But now imagine it another way. What if he was simply wanting to be close? Not just out of attachment, but because somehow he felt that bond was important, that his presence there made a difference. Now I want to ask you a very sincere question. When you look back and remember those moments, do you feel like your dog just lived with you? Or do you feel like he looked out for you? This is a question that many people begin to answer differently with the pass of time. Because when the silence in the house appears, when the place where he slept seems empty, when certain memories come back unexpectedly, something starts to become very clear. Some bonds don't disappear. They just change shape. And maybe that's exactly why so many people continue to feel something special when they remember their dogs. As if the story between the two of you wasn't completely over. As if part of that bond was still alive somehow. Now tell me something. Did your dog follow you around the house like that too? That sound of paws behind you. Did it happen every day? If this happened to you, write here in the comments. Because when a lot of people start sharing these stories, one thing becomes increasingly evident. These bonds are much deeper than they seem. And perhaps this explains why some memories continue to warm the heart, even after so long.